Okay, so hi, this is Nadia. This is going to be a sort of performance lecture, all about accidental sounds. I just, maybe a quick introduction how I came across John Cage and this piece. That was when I was doing my MA at Central St. Martin's in 2009, when one of my rare trips to the library, when we had to start thinking about our essays. And I came across him and I just was totally fascinated by his working method, which I very much adapted to my own kind of sculptural and theatrical practice. I did my piece, my MA thesis on 433, which some of you probably know, and if you don't know it, you will know after this. I was just really intrigued. We're going to experience this piece in a minute, but I was really intrigued how something so minimal can actually have so much sort of life in it, and it actually took John Cage half a lifetime to come to that point. Yeah, so I'm not approaching it as a musician because I'm not that. I'm an artist. As I said, I have adopted his kind of chance methods, improvisation, play, and so on, into my own artistic practice. And so I'm not approaching it from a musical point of view, but rather from an artistic point of view. And what I will do is, when we've experienced the piece in a bit, I will take it and sort of dissect it and basically link all of the things that led to him composing it. So let's start. John Cage's 433. So that was it. That didn't even feel that long. Sometimes it can feel that quite long. So essentially the piece is a silent piece, or supposedly silent, with the time of 4 minutes and 33 seconds. And I'm now going to kind of look at you know, the different kind of elements that led to it, and also looking where it was performed first in 1952. But first, let's look at the historical context when this piece was composed and also shown for the first time at the Maverick Concert Hall outside Woodstock, a wonderful place, in summer of 1952. But the historical context, basically, we're in America. John Cage is American, born in California in 1912, son of an inventor and of a librarian, I believe, who studied kind of traditional composition with interesting characters, but also architecture and painting, traveled in Europe at the age of around 18, came back. So we're going to jump around. This is not chronological, but I just want to kind of, you know, stress or focus in what kind of context this piece was performed. So we have here a Rothko, so abstract expressionism was kind of going strong, you know, a sort of tendency to abstraction, a new avant-garde, which was kind of developed out of different kinds of things. The Surrealists were partly responsible for the kind of abstraction of what these guys painted, but of course also everything, the whole kind of situation in America at the time. And we're gonna jump around and kind of, you know, hopefully put ourselves into the early 1950s through these videos. You probably will laugh at me for doing these hyperlinks. I haven't yet figured out how I can just put these movies into a PowerPoint, but I also quite like it because it's quite a sort of data way of doing things and having a view of everything that is kind of around just the main thing that I'm showing you. And also the time, I guess, it takes for uploading these things is probably also appropriate.
Like so many people these days, we live in the suburbs, and Dave needs the car every day for business. When he was gone, I was practically a prisoner in my own home. I couldn't get out to see my friends, couldn't take part in PTA activities. I couldn't need to. I had to wait till Thursday night they brought the car home. But that's all changed now. 3 weeks ago,
destructive force of 15,000 tons of TNT, a mass of rubble. Yet, less than a mile from ground zero, a human being in a shelter should have survived. House number 1, 3,500 feet from ground zero. House number 1 as the blast hits it. On news now, civil defense observers witnessed effects of the blast in the tremendous glare of the fireball. Operation Q, the atomic test program of the Federal Civil Defense Administration, as seen by Joan Collins report.
I had to see Operation Q through many eyes, not only my own, but as a reporter through the eyes of the average American man and woman.
Zero.
Throughout the Cold War, many Americans harbored an intense fear and hatred of communism. Why were they so afraid? Where did this hatred come from? In February of 1950, Senator Joseph McCarthy produced a list of 205 names. He claimed that all of these names were people who worked within the State Department and were also communist. Following this revelation, Senator McCarthy began a series of congressional investigations in which countless accusations were made towards many individuals. Senator McCarthy's investigations, as well as those by the House Un-American Activities Committee, helped create the atmosphere of fear and resentment towards communists that would dominate the next 2 decades. Because of Senator McCarthy's efforts, the phrase McCarthyism was used to describe the act of accusing someone with little or no evidence. In the early 1950s, there were also several pieces of legislation passed that increased the paranoia against communism. The best example was the Internal Security Act of 1950. This law required communist organizations to register with the Attorney General's office.
So maybe some kind of views of why Cage kind of wanted to do a silent piece. In fact, as a child, when he was doing some sort of speech at the Hollywood Bowl, he mentioned this idea of silence and that America should shut up, basically. So we're going on and looking at the place where this piece was first performed. It's the Maverick Concert Hall just outside of Woodstock, an amazing building that was built by a guy called Harvey White. He was a community builder, novelist, poet, entrepreneur, and he built it all with kind of local materials. And as you can see, you can visit this place. It's obviously still there. It was built, I think, in 1916. So it's a concert hall that has the audience kind of sitting half out and half inside of the building, and it's open towards the back. And there's no accident that John Cage, wanted to perform his silent piece in that particular place. And the reason why I was showing you or making a listen to Beethoven Sixth or whatever it was, it's because nature has obviously been a kind of traditional classical music, and so in this place, he kind of put his piece again back into that conventional, or in a sort of a conventional traditional theme. In the people who went to see this piece were actually, from the avant-garde, a lot of the people from New York coming up, vacationing members of the New York Symphony Orchestra, and they came to see this piece not isolated, but rather kind of embedded in a whole series of avant-garde music pieces, a lot of them working with atonal techniques. Atonal is the only thing really I know is that it doesn't have a tonal center, and you'll hear that when we listen to these things, as well as the 12-tone technique, all kind of adapted and learned from Arnold Schoenberg, the guy that we're coming to. So John Cage's piece was the second last piece. I've here just got a few examples of what was performed. And the evening started with John Cage's water music. So you'll see when we look at these different kinds of performances or music styles that, you know, this is not for a very kind of traditional ear. This is for an ear that is quite used to experimental or avant-garde, you know, ways of doing things. So here we have Water Walk by John Cage. You'll notice as always, time is an incredible important thing for John Cage, or was anyway. Next one was Morton Feldman with extensions number 3. And so after a few of these, 433 was ready to go. David Tudor, who was a constant collaborator of John Cage, was the artist performing the piece. So Tudor came out on stage and placed a handwritten score, which was basically, there are different kinds of scores, and the only one I know, and so obviously it's a bit of mysticism or legend about how the score was written, but probably the best known one basically has got tacit written, which means pause and nothing else. The piece was basically performed in 3 movements, which is important, and I'll come to that. But he basically placed it onto the piano and sat motionless, and he used a stopwatch to measure the time of each movement. He signaled the commencement by lowering the keyboard lid of the piano. First movement, seconds, people were sitting still, waiting in anticipation. You could hear the wind picking up in the trees in the first movement. After the 30 seconds were gone, he raised the lid to signal the end of the first movement. It was then lowered for the second movement, during which raindrops pattered on the roof. And so each time the time was over, he basically opened the lid of the piano. The second movement obviously was the longest one, and people started to kind of, get a bit, what do you call it, moving, coughing, and thinking, well, is there anything going to happen at all? Nothing happened, of course. And the third movement, they were really quite upset. Some of them started to walk out and to kind of swear and complain or whatever. And the third movement was over, and they were in total uproar. And really walked out and said, that these people need to be kind of thrown out of Woodstock. And John Cage basically, I quote him, "They missed a point. There's no such thing as silence. What they thought was silence, because they didn't know how to listen, was full of accidental sounds. You could hear the wind stirring outside during the first movement. During the second, raindrops began pattering on the roof. And during the third, people themselves made all kinds of interesting sounds as they walked and talked or walked out." So 433 is a piece whose title is just a number from a clock, and which the performer plays nothing. And this was a turning point for Cage in his career, and one from which he could never return. But so he felt he gave them everything, but they, of course, thought that they got nothing, which is kind of understandable because nothing was done. But as he said, they didn't know how to listen. And in fact, there was all sorts of sound. And when we experienced just now, I don't know if you did hear, I'm sure wherever you are, you heard all sorts of sounds. I've got sound of someone spraying or washing their cars. Then you had helicopters flying around. Then I was coughing, then I was drinking, and so on. But these are sounds we never really listened to. And this is really what he wanted to get at, to pay attention. And we're now going to look at the various situations in his life that kind of led him to compose and perform such a piece. So we start with the time, 433, quite a mysterious, strange number. How did he decide that it was that length? And there were two things that kind of led him to this time length. One was the I Ching, or the Book of Changes, which is a guide, as it says here, to life's turning points. And it's kind of a divination book where you use yarrow sticks and numbers and you throw them. So it's kind of a bit of a chance way of deciding things for you. Someone described the I Ching once like an old friend who kind of guides you and gives you different kinds of possibilities. You in the end then decide. So by using the I Ching at that time, that was one kind of one reason why he came to this length, 433. But then there was another, and we'll have a look at that right now.
You get closer.
Not that.
Still works.
Oh.
Still works.
We'll have
Still
to
works.
do that. Okay. I think we all hate this, right? So Muzak is a brand of background music played in retail stores and other public establishments. And it was, I think, started even in the 30s or whatever in America. And it was interesting that Cage mentioned the idea of a piece composed entirely of silence during a 1947 lecture at Vassar College, a composer's confessions. He told the audience that he had several new desires, one of which was to compose a piece of uninterrupted silence and sell it to Muzak Company. It will be 3 or 4.5 minutes long, those being the standard length of canned music, and its title was going to be Silent Prayer. He never did it at that time. So he first mentioned it around that time, and in 1952, that is when he completed it, just as the courts were ruling, because there was a court sort of case against Muzak, kind of questioning whether it was legal to pipe music into public places, because obviously this sort of sounds and musics were also used to manipulate people to do certain things, to behave in certain ways. But the courts were ruling that forced listening to music was not a violation of the First Amendment. That was the ruling of 1952. And so it was interesting that he kind of started to think about it when a court case started and then when it ended. So that is the reason, so the combination of the length of music of a kind of a vinyl of Muzak is 4.5 minutes. The 3 seconds at the end was something that obviously came about by using the I Ching. Time was really important for him in many ways because he felt that sound, a sound and the silence, the thing that they share is duration. They kind of don't share anything else. He also experienced time when he was studying with was it Pierre Boulez, I think, in California. It's so interesting how these guys in the sort of 30s and 40s studied or learned things. You didn't necessarily go to a school, but you actually approached a composer or went to a composer on a recommendation from another composer or whatever, and then you would study kind of one-to-one with that composer. And one of them, I think it was Pierre Boulez, I might be wrong, but a friend of or somebody that knew Schoenberg. So he went to study with that guy for a while, and he came to one of his sessions and he was a little bit early and he knocked at the door and the guy opened the door and he said, "What do you want?" He said, "Well, I'm here for my session." And he said, "You're too early," and slammed the door in his face. Then he went to bring some library books back to the library and came back 15 minutes late. And then the guy basically told him to fuck off because he was now late, and he told him that time was essential in music, and if he didn't understand it, he better stop. So he started to think about time, so these kind of very banal and mundane little encounters and situations. But he also kind of recognized time in the music of Erik Satie. Erik Satie was a sort of bad boy celebrity in the 20s in Paris. He was associated with the Dadaists and Surrealists. Also Satie had an interesting way of composing, like very kind of random, very Dadaist in a way. He used, for example, receipts from grocery stores to compose his music. But also, as we'll see in a bit, I as a music sort of layman or not a professional musician, I can really hear how he plays with this idea of duration, with silence as well as sound. So they almost kind of become equal. Erik Satie was, a very important influence for him for all of these reasons. He was also the guy who coined the term musique d'ameublement, or furniture music, when he had lunch with the painter Fernand Léger sometime in the 20s in a brasserie where the music, they had these bands there at the time. And he said, you know, it's far too loud, it's far too dominant or whatever. And he said, we rather should use this kind of music like, you know, like the furniture that is around. So he basically took the orchestra and placed them all in different places around the thing rather than on a stage. And he started to compose these rather, I think, quite beautiful pieces of music. But here's exactly Francis Picabia, just to give you an idea of his sort of eccentricities in a piece called Entr'acte, which is a little film that was played, I think, in a ballet when there was a break. Should be coming up now. So sort of very Dadaist, surrealist activities. One of his wonderful pieces, Gymnopédies. And so the next kind of component of 433 is nothing or everything, and this question of what that is. And in Zen Buddhism, you know, nothing has always been everything, or there was no such thing as void. Basically, it's taught us that emptiness is form, form is emptiness for 2,500 years. Artists in the 40s and 50s have in their own way kind of experimented with the idea of the void, such as Rothko, Barnett Newman, and so on, and what it does or does not contain. But it is, until it is actually scientifically observed, nobody really believes it. And of course, today science has proven that empty is not empty, but actually full of stuff. We come to why Cage went to study with D.T. Suzuki, a Japanese Zen master that was teaching in the late 40s at Columbia and all over America, due to kind of Japan opening up since the Second World War. But Suzuki, he told him that emptiness does not mean relativity or phenomenality or nothingness, but rather means the absolute. So the emptiness of 433 is not something negative, but reality. So we'd almost could call that piece a hyper reality, if you like. But just a little bit why he went, he kind of, you know, started to look at Zen in the late 40s. So we're kind of running, you know, from around the 30s or whatever, all the way to 52, all jumping around chronologically. But he kind of was in a bit of a struggle in the 40s, personally, and with his music. You know, he was splitting up with his wife. He also kind of, it was around that time that he you know, realized that he was actually gay, which of course at that time was not the easiest thing to realize and to be. He kind of just was in a crisis. He felt people were not getting his music, and yeah, he was in a crisis personally as well. He was studying with Arnold Schoenberg, not in the 50s, but around somewhere in the 30s. And Schoenberg was an Austrian-born composer, music theorist, teacher, and writer, and was widely considered one of the most influential composers of the 20th century. He was associated with the Expressionist movement in German poetry and art, but with the rise of the Nazi Party in 1933, Schoenberg's works were labeled degenerate music because they were modernist and atonal. So he emigrated to the States, and Cage studied with him. Schoenberg was very much, although his music might not necessarily sound harmonious, but then, you know, maybe of you musicians understand what harmony is. It doesn't necessarily mean harmony as kind of someone like me understands it, but we'll come to that anyway. But he was very much about harmony, and he told Cage that if he's not going to get into this harmony thing, he was going to bang his head against the wall for the rest of his life. To which Cage kind of replied that then he will do that, and he left Schoenberg on the back of that. So kind of a little bit in a crisis in the late 40s. And friends of his told him to go to see a psychiatrist, basically, to kind of sort out his doubts and anxieties. And he went to one session, and at the end of the session, the psychiatrist said, "Look, we're going to have you compose like mad, you know, when we're done with you." And he said, "Well, that's not what I want. I want to, you know, do the right thing." So he didn't really kind of click with the whole psychotherapy thing. And he heard of D.T. Suzuki teaching, and so he went to his lectures at Columbia, you know, he was kind of, because he was after answers, he was asking you know, Suzuki, like, what, you know, what do you think of music? So that's kind of when we're all struggling in our kind of artistic practices, we kind of want maybe someone else to tell us, but actually at the end of the day we need to figure it out ourselves. So he, you know, told him he didn't know anything about music. Well, then John Cage said, "Well, what about art? You know, can you tell me about art?" He don't know anything about art. So that's when he knew that he had to kind of do his own thinking. Suzuki had, you know, Zen teaching is kind of teaching without teaching. So one funny story was that often when he started his teaching, he opened the window. So that it was really quite noisy from the streets outside, and he would start whispering, and that was his teaching. So teaching without teaching. So Zen kind of taught him that he has to let go of his ego as an artist. Not that Suzuki told him that, but he learned it through his teachings, his likes and dislikes. So kind of removing himself. And the other thing that helped Cage kind of let go of his own likes and dislikes, because his subjective kind of compositions or whatever didn't really reach the audience. It wasn't understood. The other thing that he started to realize is that he has to include chance methods into his compositions. So he used these magic square-like charts, you know, to compose music. And so he kind of discovered this idea of indeterminacy, that you don't have a premeditated idea, but you kind of, yeah, use chance methods to kind of to compose something. And that's what he did. And also Zen taught him that it opens, Zen itself opens the psyche from within to a more intense awareness of everyday life. And this is also essentially what Cage started to realize what music was when he different cultures, so Indian culture and so on, and through that and through asking what music was for these cultures, he learned that it wasn't about entertainment, but rather, to wake you up to a more intense awareness of everyday life. So look and listen to everything. Don't be distracted, which is quite interesting when we think about people like Rothko or Barnett Newman, these abstract expressionists or color field painters. They all had to kind of make away with all of these distractions that they had in their work before they came to their kind of signature style. So I always quite like to think about these guys as well. So Chance, using the I Ching again that he was given by a student of his, the Surrealists were in New York waiting out the war, and they also were responsible partly for, people, that the kind of new avant-garde that was happening in New York in post-World War II. So people like Pollock or whatever. So abstraction, but also Chance, using his kind of using his drip painting, drip technique or whatever, and just basically letting things fly. Here, I think, is a piece that he did. It was the first piece that he composed using the I Ching, and I think it was about 44 minutes long, and it was for Merce Cunningham. He's life partner in life, so he's kind of romantically involved with Merce Cunningham, the choreographer, as well as in the Merce Cunningham company, for which he composed a lot of music. And I just want to mention how they worked together most of the time. Merce Cunningham and Cage came together, and this is quite a nice interview you can find online. They didn't talk about what the dance or the music should be, but they rather gave each other a time. So they said 18 minutes. Merce then went away and composed or choreographed the dance. Cage went away and did some experimentation with, God knows what. He was playing around with electronic radios and all sorts of stuff. I think cactuses and God knows. And then they came back together and brought the choreography and the music together. So completely disparate things. And for those of you who kind of know my practice or have seen my piece that we've screened the other day, this is kind of what I find really interesting. So to bring these disparate things together to create a new whole, because it sort of does automatically by being on the same platform, but also it colors off, each other, I think, in the minds of the people who are watching it. But this is, we're not going to obviously listen to the whole thing, but this is what his first piece sounds like. Created with these chance methods using the I Ching. Onwards, we've got quite a lot to get through. The next thing, noise, obviously a component of 433, or unintended sound, or things we don't consider music, which John Cage did consider, as music, or they were as musical for him as a normal kind of chord or whatever. I'm not going to go into Schoenberg because I kind of talked to you about it. You can, I don't know if you can access that afterwards, I hope so. But various different people kind of led him to, you know, choose to compose using noise or percussion or whatever, rather than traditional instruments. And one was Oskar Fischinger. He was abstract filmmaker, someone who created visual music. So he was playing around in the 30s, 20s and 30s. In fact, he was introduced to the Bauhaus, and they were showing his work there in the 20s. But he was doing, you know, he was scratching things into the film strip or whatever, and created this kind of visual music. But also he did the other, the reverse, where he created these kind of collages and animations that were, you know, playing, you know, jumping around and dancing to music. And what John Cage worked with him on an experimental film or an animation whilst Fischinger was in LA. I think he was working for Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, as a lot of these people did. Schoenberg did the same. And what Fischinger told him, he was quite an esoteric character into kind of all Eastern, Far Eastern philosophies and so on. And he said to Cage that everything in the world has its own spirit. And this spirit becomes audible by setting it into vibration. So Cage was very excited by this notion and began tapping, scraping and rubbing things in his environment, which led then to his first percussion orchestra and a number of new percussion works. So from this, Cage concluded that noises were just as musical as so-called musical sounds. You know, he was writing many percussion works after that time, you know, in the 30s. You know, and maybe today we've sort of come to accept the idea that noises can be included in music. At the time, it was really pretty radical. And let's just look at Fischinger's beautiful optical poem here. Fantastic stuff. And then Luigi Russolo, which is a futurist musician, as well as a painter, part of the futurist, Italian futurist, a movement that started in around 1909 and 1910 in Italy. You know, Italy at that time was quite backwards in terms of technologies or whatever, but they started slowly lagging behind a bit, but they started slowly to have obviously cars and trams and things in the city. And the futurists were trying to push this and embrace this urban kind of noises of machines and constructions or whatever. And he read his manifesto and found a lot of things that really resonated thinking, John Cage's own thinking. And so he became a great big influence on him. He created these wonderful instruments, he called them. They're called intonarumori, and we'll have a look at how they work. Sorry. Mad machines. And Russolo was always talking or kind of bouncing off nature sounds and sounds of the city. And as I said, they were really embracing this sort of sounds of the city, which of course we all despise or think they're horrible or whatever, but they loved them. And he said when his guys were playing these instruments for the first time, when they went out into the streets, they would actually actively listen to these noises and actually find them really quite beautiful. So yeah, another person who kind of drove him to listen or to use noise in his composition. Barese, I'm not going to go there, but he was a French composer who composed almost exclusively for percussion. So again, I don't know if you can access that. I hope so. You can go and check this out, or you do it, write his name down or whatever, you'll find it. But I want to kind of come to the prepared piano. That was a kind of Cage's invention, and for which he mostly composed all of his life. And how did he come to the prepared piano? The prepared piano is something where you put things into the strings, and I'll show you it in a minute. But basically, he was teaching. He was mostly really poor. He called himself poor like a church mouse. And he was sort of going from California, Seattle, New York, God knows, around the place, always, being the kind of music accompaniment for dancers and so on. So the Cornish School in Seattle, where he was being an accompanist in the late 30s, Sylvia Ford, an African-American dancer, asked him to compose a piece or to do a piece of music for her, a piece called Bacchanal, which was a dance that had a very obviously African theme to it. And so he was, working with percussion at the time and whatever, but the stage where she was dancing really didn't have space for a whole percussion orchestra, plus he didn't know how to get one to there or whatever. The only thing that stage had was a grand piano. So he came up with the idea of, he was thinking of the grand piano, and actually if we do think about the grand piano, it is kind of a percussion instrument because the kind of wooden bits hit the strings, right? And that's what makes the sound. And so he started to put things into that grand piano, and in between the you know, the strings and whatever makes a sound, so screws or ashtrays or eggs even or whatever. And of course, you then have another element of chance and of indeterminacy or aleatoric, you know, music, as he called it, which aleatoric means chance. So let's have a look at one of these wonderful prepared pianos and the sort of surprise sounds that this makes once you have placed all of the things into it. So noise, you know, making a noise here again. So there he was. He was a single, you know, one-man orchestra all of a sudden, you know, using this idea or the prepared piano for Sylvia Ford's Dance Bacchanal in 1938. Here's just a nice image of what harmony is in music, because I found it very difficult to kind of I guess because I'm a visual person, although I do love sound and I work a lot with sound as well, but I think this is a perfect image of what harmony is, because it's different things that with different sizes, but they sort of balance in a strange way and not in a kind of linear way necessarily, but I think that just explains harmony music quite nicely. And of course, the biggest part of 433 is silence. And after working with all this noise or whatever and doing that kind of noise thing and percussion thing, he wanted to actually really know whether there is such a thing as silence. And he went up to Harvard into an anechoic chamber, which are these sort of chambers, these places, and you probably know them from, you know, recording studios or whatever. They're spaces where there is absolutely no sound coming in from the outside. And he went up there and sat in this anechoic chamber. And, you know, to investigate whether, you know, there is such a thing as silence. And he came out and he spoke to the technician and said, you know, I heard two noises. One was a very high-pitched noise. And if we're just still now for a moment, not even listening to the accidental sounds in our sort of environments right now, if we just shut up for a bit, 30 seconds. Can you hear the very high-pitched sound that seems to be in your ears? I think we can all hear it if we pay attention. So that was one sound that he heard. And the other sound he heard was a more kind of, and I don't think we can hear that so well, or I can't really hear it at all, but he could, which is a more sort of flowing, deeper kind of sound. So the technician said, okay, there is the high-pitched one is your nervous system, which I find really interesting. And the other one is kind of your blood flowing, or your heart or whatever flowing, you know, pumping the blood around your body. So he had a proof that there was no such thing as silence at all. And I think if we do pay attention, we realize there is, you know, we don't ever experience silence. Although it's quite nice at the moment not having planes in the sky, and that is quite a strange and beautiful reality actually at the moment, because it is very quiet in the sky. Anyway, so that is silence. I've talked a little bit about East and West. He encountered various different personalities from India, but also Western kind of composers, an English composer, Thomas Mays, because he was so after, like, what is this thing? What is music? What is the function of it? And he was teaching Gita Sarabhai, an Indian student who came to America to learn Western composition. And he said he would teach her for free if she was teaching him about, you know, music in her culture. And one of the questions came up is like, what is the purpose of music in your culture? And she said, the purpose of music is to sober and quiet the mind, thus rendering it susceptible to divine influences. And Thomas Mays here said something very similar. He was an English composer. Ananda Kumaraswamy was a writer and teacher and philosopher that was introducing Indian culture to the West. And he said that all art should imitate nature in the manner of operation rather than of its outward appearances. And I think I kind of understand that, but you can kind of throw that around in your head and try and understand it. So East is West and West is East. There wasn't really any different. So he came to the conclusion that music shouldn't be entertainment, but it should be something that wakes man and woman up to, you know, the life that they're living. So that's what music should be. So hence he played nothing. Which, and of course, this piece does do that. It makes us listen, but we need to, you know, we need to probably experience it twice to then actually read. 3 movements. Why that was really just a kind of to give it structure. You know, he gave it structure by performing it in a sort of concert setting, to have the piano, the audience, and all of that. It's a classicizing feature of a sonata, and it really is there to frame the work. You know, an uninterrupted stretch of silence might have seemed too formless, lacking any sort of objective feature that would convince the audience to recognize it as a work. You know, so it wasn't just actually there to be a philosophical statement or a bit of a Dada joke. It was actually a work, a piece of music. In fact, later he said, you know, that piece can be any length of time. It doesn't have to have movements, but, you know, to kind of introduce it, it had to have that. So kind of to give it form. Now, the one that really tipped him and kicked he's asked to do this silent piece, because as we mentioned at the beginning of this talk, he kind of was thinking about doing something like that, you know, in the late 40s. He met Rauschenberg at Black Mountain College, a wonderful art school. I'm just going to go to it here. That exists from 1933 to 1957, a progressive art school founded by John Andrew Rice, I believe, a lecturer, academic that was thrown out of a university that he was teaching previously. Because he didn't really believe in tests or marking or whatever, but rather he believed in experimentation. And the date's quite interesting when this thing was founded, because a lot of the guys that were teaching at the Bauhaus in Germany at the time, who were also being thrown out of Germany, came over to the state and started teaching there. Joseph Albers was one of them, Annie Albers, his wife. Einstein, I think, came over and taught there. So it was a school where actually students and teachers were leading or doing, you know, doing the teaching and the learning or whatever. They were also kind of running the school. I think it was financed by sort of patrons, wealthy patrons from New York or whatever. But a really, you know, a school that put, you know, focus on experimentation. And so, you know, Rauschenberg was up there, Cage was teaching up there in the summers, Merce Cunningham, a lot of people like Willem de Kooning, Buckminster Fuller and all that were kind of alumni or, you know, students and teachers. So he was up there in 1951 and did his white paintings. John Cage met him around that time. And, you know, you might know Robert Rauschenberg. If you don't, he did later on kind of works that were called combines that were full of stuff. But this is kind of a card, you know, a new beginning, a sort of 0-degree painting, reacting against abstract expressionism, against the drama of it, the subjectivity of it, because these paintings were actually painted just with a roller and house paint. So you can see how they kind of would understand each other in that they want to remove themselves from the work. They want you as the viewer or the listener to kind of to do the story, to do the storytelling, which is also something that really resonates with me and my practice. So John Cage saw these things and said, you know, it's amazing, like these, they have no touch of the artist's hand, they're completely like void of anything, but at the same time they're catching everything that is in the room. You know, you could almost see how many people are actually in a room on these paintings. And he then said, look, if I now don't do this silent piece, I will, you know, music will lag behind. So these works were really kind of the trigger for him to finally do this piece and perform this piece. And of course, Rauschenberg, Jasper Johns later on, Cage and Cunningham became this sort of wonderful quartet of avant-garde artists in the 50s that hung out together and did work together or whatever. So they were 4 great friends. Theatre is another aspect, I guess, of the piece. And John Cage always said when he went to concerts and things with his parents when he was a kid, he was more interested rather than listening to the music or whatever, he was more interested to look at, a trombonist or a trumpetist or whatever to empty his spit valve rather than him playing the music. So these things that we're not supposed to look at is what he's interested in. Theater also, he encountered street theater in Europe and Northern America, and he found it interesting how the audience really became a part of a performance or a play. So this idea of participation. So in the silent piece, there would be coughing, there would be kind of shift. The audience is participating. I'm going to finish with that because that's then kind of the beginning of something else, which is a sort of proto-happening, a wonderful performance or theatre piece number 1 that he did with lots of kind of interesting no name, like Franz Klein, the painter, whatever. It was called The Event. Alan Capro was one of the audience members and very much kind of took this model in a way and created his happenings later. So you can see the audience is in the middle. So he reverses this idea of performer and audience and puts them almost kind of as the protagonists. So again, this idea of participation and inclusion. And these are all different disparate things that come together. So Robert Rauschenberg played on his monograph, he scratched Edith Piaf records, he suspended paintings, Maurice Cunningham was dancing, David Judah was doing here, he was giving a lecture, poets reading poems. Totally disparate kind of chaotic material coming together, but somehow, and if you do know Robert Rauschenberg's paintings, that is really how they should be read. Everything will be kind of coloring the thing that comes after it or is next to it or whatever. But yeah, it's very kind of free of interpretation. And I don't really know why I finished with that, but it's just, I guess maybe that's back to my work. But I hope that was a little, I think that's it, yeah. That was a nice journey of sound and visuals and spoken words that maybe is now making this silent piece that seems so minimal much more fuller or much more full of stuff. And I don't know what we're doing now, or are we chatting, or I don't know. I can stop sharing my screen and maybe we come back to
yeah, we can have a chat now if you want, Nadia. We have a little bit of time.
Well, I don't really want, but if you have questions or if people have questions or whatever.
Let me check. I mean, I'm quite happy to leave it there. I think that was a lot of information, but really, really interesting.
I'm leave it there too.
Let's do that then. Thank you everybody for tuning in and who's been kind of catching our workshop series. We have one more tomorrow for you before we have an open studio towards the end of the week. So thank you so much, Nadia. That was absolutely wonderful. And it's great to hear kind of where Cage was coming into your practice as well.
Thank you so much.
We'll sign off there. Goodbye.
Bye.